I saw my wife on the dance floor. Getting too close to some guy, what they were doing was far from dancing. She had clearly had too much to drink. I moved toward them, swiftly pulled her arms from around his neck, and began to lead her away. "What's your deal, man?" the guy she was with demanded. "I'm her husband, and we're leaving," I replied. His initial intent to challenge me faded almost immediately. "Take her, she's all yours," he scoffed, dismissively. "She's no fun in bed when she's drunk anyway." I asked. "And when she's sober," he replied, "she's fantastic. Just ask around, everyone knows she's top-notch." Someone opened the door as I carried her to my truck and drove to her parents' house. I laid her on her bed. She was already unconscious, probably out cold, even on the dance floor. Without saying a word, I left. Ruth is my older sister. Esther Jacobs is the other. My brothers are Adrian and Henry Payne, and I'm Lewis Payne. Raised by Southern Baptist parents in Von Orr, Tennessee, we attended church regularly with little access to TV or radio, and our parents read only the Bible. We grew up in poverty and were determined not to repeat our parents' lifestyle. After high school, our main goal was to leave Von Orr. Ruth and Adrian moved to Nashville, while Esther and Henry stayed in Madisonville. College wasn't an option for us. Ruth found a job as an assistant cook in a diner, and Adrian, after facing struggles at truck driving school, got help from an instructor and secured a driving job for a Nashville Star, usually a role for experienced drivers. Adrian thrived as a truck driver, thanks to his great personality. After high school, I earned a 4-year Army ROTC scholarship to Vanderbilt University and became a second lieutenant upon graduation. My first assignment was in Korea with the 8th Army, where I served for 13 months before returning home on a 30-day leave. I then reported to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. During my leave, I visited family and spent time in Nashville with Ruth. Adrian was on the road, driving for a Nashville Star. While staying with Ruth, I met her boyfriend Gerald Thompson and his sister Debbie. Debbie and I started dating, and by the end of my leave, we were in a relationship. Since Fort Campbell was near Nashville, we spent a lot of time together. We became close on our 4th date, which became a regular part of our relationship, and eventually, we married 18 months later. After Fort Campbell, we were transferred to Germany, which was a significant change for us. Debbie joined social clubs, learned to play bridge, and we traveled throughout Europe. In our last months there, Debbie developed a liking for European wine, while I, raised in a home without alcohol, never acquired a taste for it. Our next post brought us back to Fort Campbell, which we were both glad about. We settled into government housing and enjoyed about 6 months of contentment. Then, Debbie began spending more time in Nashville. We'd visit for the weekend, and she'd often want to stay an extra day or two soon. Those extra days stretched to 3 or more. By year's end, Debbie was practically living with her parents. I would visit on weekends, and one Friday, I arrived early, only to find Debbie not home. Her parents were unsure of her whereabouts. I had shown up just after lunch, having finished work early. Debbie's mother explained they hadn't expected me so soon. As I was about to take my overnight bag to Debbie's room, her mother tried to stop me, saying, "Give me a chance to tidy up first." I said it was fine. The room was a mess, with dirty clothes scattered everywhere. I noticed the bed, though covered with dirty clothes, appeared made and untouched. It hadn't been slept in for at least a couple of nights, given the pile. Her mother was picking up some of the clothes and kicked a pair of Debbie's underwear under the bed. I managed to get her out of the room by telling her I needed to use the bathroom. Once she was gone, I retrieved her underwear from under the bed and found 2 more pairs. One of them appeared to have some kind of white substance on it. I sat on the bed and examined them, but couldn't bring myself to sniff them for confirmation. Taking the underwear to the living room, I showed them to Debbie's mother, who had just finished a phone call. Holding up the underwear, I asked, "How long has she been seeing other men?" Her mother replied, "That's something you'll have to discuss with her." I went back to the bedroom, grabbed my overnight bag, shoved the underwear into a side pocket, and headed toward the door. As I was leaving, her mother asked, "Are you coming back?" Without answering, I left and drove straight to Ruth's house. Although Ruth and Debbie's brother had broken up a few years ago, They remained friends. Since then, Ruth had married Eric Wyndham, who owned a music store. Debbie and I had returned to the US for their wedding. On my way to Ruth's, I called her, and she told me where to find her hidden key. She was busy and couldn't talk, mentioning that she wouldn't be home until midnight because she had to close the restaurant that night. When I got to her house, I tried calling Debbie but got no answer, so I left a message. This is your husband, the only man you're supposed to be with. I need you to explain why that's no longer the case. I also want to know how many other men there have been and why. Eric got home around 7, and I filled him in on everything. Ruth called shortly after 8, telling me that her ex-boyfriend, Debbie's brother, had just heard from a friend that Debbie was drunk and flirting with several men at the Count of Monte Music Bar. He was on his way to pick her up and take her home, but Ruth assured him that I was already there and would handle the situation. When I dropped Debbie off at her parents' house, they were both there. Her mother began blaming me, saying Debbie's behavior was my fault because I took her to Germany, where she learned to drink and engage in all kinds of unacceptable behavior. I glanced at them briefly, walked out, and went back to Ruth's house. Eric and I talked until Ruth got home, and then the three of us stayed up talking well past 3 in the morning. I crashed on their sofa again. I woke up at 7, made a cup of coffee, and sat on their front porch, preparing myself for a conversation with Debbie. Ruth and Eric joined me around 9, and we continued talking for another hour. They asked about my plans, but I told them I hadn't figured it out yet. The next day, around 10, I rang the doorbell at my in-laws' house. Debbie's father answered and let me in. Debbie was on the sofa, sipping coffee. I approached her and placed the stained underwear on her coffee cup. She picked them up, threw them on the floor, and took another sip. Why, I asked Debbie. Before she could respond, her mother cut in. You don't need to answer that, sweetie, I replied coldly. Stay out of this. I looked at Debbie again and repeated. Why, she glanced up at me and said, I needed to be loved, and you weren't around. How many times have you needed love? And I wasn't here, I pressed. What, she asked. How many times have you cheated with other men? I repeated. I don't know, she said. Take a guess, I urged. Maybe a couple dozen, she said hesitantly. How many different men? I asked. I'm not sure, she said. Guess I insisted. 6, maybe 7, maybe 10, I'm not really sure, she answered. Does our marriage mean anything to you? I asked. She looked up, stared directly at me, and took another sip of coffee without replying. I walked out, went back to Ruth's place, and quickly told them what had happened. Did she show any remorse or apologize? Ruth asked. Nope, I answered. Wow, she's really heartless, Ruth remarked. I thought the same thing, I agreed. With no reason to stay in Nashville, I decided to head back to Fort Campbell on Sunday afternoon. I was taken aback when Debbie walked into our house. I was lying on the couch, and she sat on the armrest near my feet. After a few minutes, she said, I'm sorry. Don't say another word. If your excuse for cheating is that I wasn't around when you wanted affection, that's just sad. You deliberately stayed away from home, making sure I couldn't be there for you. Instead of coming home, you chose to get drunk and sleep with strangers, ruining our marriage. Your parents are just as much to blame for allowing you to act like this. The only thing left for you to do is pack your things and leave. I don't want to leave. I've apologized and promised it won't happen again, she pleaded. I don't care if it happens again. As far as I'm concerned, we're no longer married, so do whatever you want with whoever you want. All I care about now is you leaving. I picked up the remote and turned on the TV. She grabbed it from my hand, hit the mute button, and said, I'm not leaving. You're my husband, and this is my house. She tossed the remote back at me and walked out of the room. While she made dinner, I fixed a sandwich and ate it in the living room. She stayed in the kitchen and ate whatever she had cooked. When it was time for bed, I took a shower and went to bed. She followed, showered, and tried to cuddle up next to me. I turned away. Do you really think I'd sleep with you after you've been with 6, 7, or even 10 other men? I said. I apologized, she replied. And you think that makes everything okay? Yes, she answered. You seriously need help. I can't stop you from sleeping in this bed, but I don't have to lie here and think about all those other men with you. I got up, went to the living room, and slept on the couch. When I woke up, she was sitting in a chair, watching me. I ignored her, showered, shaved, dressed in my uniform, and headed to work. After checking in at work, I spoke with my commander and updated him on the situation. He advised, if I were you, my first step would be to consult a lawyer. Take all the time you need. That day, I met with several attorneys before deciding on Kirby Dickinson, a retired Army lawyer who understood the unique issues military personnel face. What exactly do you need from me, and why, he asked. I need your guidance because I'm completely lost. I replied. Are you interested in trying to save your marriage, he asked. No, I said firmly. Why not, he pressed. Because she cheated, and I can't accept that in a marriage. How do you know she was unfaithful, he asked. I explained the details to him. That kind of evidence doesn't carry much weight in court, Lieutenant, he said, noting my rank. She could claim she slept with the Army and Navy football teams in front of a full stadium and then deny it in court. Without solid proof, a judge might side with her version of events. He shook his head. Those are the facts. So, since you're not looking to reconcile, I assume you want a divorce, right? Yes, sir. That's right, I confirmed. And you probably want to make things tough for her, right? Yes, sir. Exactly, I nodded. Good. I like it when clients agree with me. It reinforces what I already know. And what's that, I asked. That I'm a clever son of a witch, he said with a grin. We both laughed. Here's my advice, he continued. If she's still living with you, ignore her. No matter how much she yells, screams, or throws things, just give her the cold shoulder. Hopefully she'll decide to leave either back to her parents, her boyfriend, or somewhere else. Once she's gone, she'll probably slip back into her old habits and find someone new. We just need someone there to record it. Even if the judge rules we can't use the footage, it will still prove you were truthful about her cheating. I'm pretty sure the court will rule in your favor. That's usually the case in Kentucky. The downside to this approach is that we'll need someone available 24/7 to film her activities, which won't be cheap. However, I'm confident it will work out well for you in the end. Are you on board with this? Absolutely, I responded. Great. First, write a check for my fee, and another for the private investigator I'll arrange, he instructed. While I felt relieved, I also felt financially drained. When I returned to my office at 6 that evening, Debbie called, but following Kirby Dickinson's advice, I ignored it. When I got home after 10, Debbie was waiting for me. How long is this going to go on? I've apologized. Let's just go back to how things were, she said. Without responding, I headed straight for the shower. 20 minutes later, as I settled into bed, I heard her car drive away. I got up, checked our shared closet, and noticed that most of her clothes were gone. I went back to bed and fell asleep. The next morning, I contacted Kirby Dickinson and informed him that Debbie had likely gone to Nashville. Perfect. I have connections there. Do you know where she might be staying, he asked. I provided her parents' address. Excellent. Let's get started, he said. In less than a week, I received a video showing her with 2 men. Within 48 hours of receiving the footage, she was served with divorce papers citing adultery. Less than an hour after she was served, she called me, crying and begging for forgiveness. I ended the call without saying a word. I kept my boss updated on the situation. He had experienced something similar years ago. His wife had cheated on him while he was deployed in a combat zone. Cheating on someone who's in a war zone is one of the worst betrayals. Next, I informed Post Housing that I would be vacating the quarters. The next day, I moved into the bachelor officers' quarters BOQ. 3 days later, Debbie called, saying she couldn't get into the house. I told her it wasn't our home anymore. I had moved out because she abandoned me, and as a single officer, I wasn't entitled to Post Housing anymore. But we're still married, she argued. I chuckled and ended the call, figuring she'd likely go back to Nashville. As I've mentioned, I don't drink alcohol. Growing up Southern Baptist, I never acquired a taste for it, and that didn't change in adulthood. The same goes for swearing. I never got used to bad language. I don't mind if others drink or curse, but it's just not my thing. Similarly, I'm not into dancing closely, though seeing women in revealing outfits can be thrilling. I appreciate the female form, and if a woman wants to show it off, I'm definitely interested in looking. However, that night, I used every curse word I knew, and probably invented a few new ones, as I watched the video of my wife with two men. I played it on my computer, and it started with her dancing with two men on a crowded dance floor. They were engaging in actions meant for private spaces, like bedrooms. She had one hand on each of their pants, and the scene continued for several minutes before they left the dance floor, exited the building, and got into a car. The detective followed them to a run-down motel, circled the area, and found a room with the window open. But it wasn't the right one, so he kept searching until he spotted Debbie's room. Her window was also open, and they didn't seem to care. They quickly undressed and got right to it. Watching my wife undress in front of two men felt surreal, but it was nothing compared to what followed. At first, I thought she might be drunk, but her words didn't suggest that. "Come on, guys," she said, "show me what you've got. I've never done this with two at once. It should be interesting." The taller man responded, "It will be you'll have more guys in and out of you than you could ever imagine." "Don't call me that, I hate that word," she snapped. The shorter man then stepped out of his shorts, walked over to her, grabbed her hair, and yanked her head back. "You're a hoe, and we'll keep calling you that," he said, yanking her hair again and forcing her to kneel. "Now do what you do best." Ho, she reached for him and took him into her mouth. The taller man then grabbed her hair, pulling her off the shorter guy. "My turn, Ho," he said, and she obeyed. The shorter man added, "Hoes do BJs, don't they?" she continued, but he pulled her off again, repeating his comment. She nodded. "You're doing my Johnson, what does that make you?" He taunted. "A hoe," she whispered. "I didn't hear you," he snapped. She repeated it louder. She kept alternating between the two men until the taller man pulled her toward the bed. "Oh my God," she moaned, nearly fainting. They lay side by side for several minutes before the shorter man asked, "Wasn't bad, huh? You want more?" Then both men had her at once, one on each side. She screamed, but it didn't stop them. Eventually, the screams turned into moans, and she began moving again. I hit the pause button and shut down my computer, feeling overwhelmed. Her behavior was beyond anything I could rationalize. She had said her need for love drove her to cheat, but that excuse felt like one of the weakest I'd ever heard. When I confronted her, she didn't even attempt to deny her actions. Her parents likely knew about the underwear I had taken and could guess what they revealed. They probably spoke to her first thing that morning, so when I arrived, she was already aware that the truth was out. That week, work was a welcome escape. Staying busy from morning until night helped keep my mind off the disturbing video. On Friday, Kirby Dickinson called to let me know we had a meeting scheduled with Debbie and her lawyer on Monday. When I arrived, Debbie was there with her parents. I asked Kirby to suggest to her lawyer that it might be best if her parents didn't witness the explicit video we were about to show. Kirby relayed this to Debbie's attorney, and I watched as he discussed it with Debbie and her parents. Debbie looked visibly upset, shaking her head in disagreement. I overheard her saying, "I don't believe them. It was clear that all pretense was gone, and as Kirby had said, it was game on." The proceedings moved quickly. Debbie's attorney requested that the adultery charge be replaced with one of mental cruelty, arguing that I had caused her so much emotional pain that she could no longer bear to be around me, which supposedly justified her almost constant stay at her parents' house. Kirby and I exchanged glances, my computer set up on the table with the video cued to the exact moment I had paused it. Kirby asked Debbie, "Are you sure you want your parents to see this?" Debbie, defiant, replied, "See what? Me holding hands or dancing with someone? Go ahead, show your worst." I pressed play, and the entire room watched the video unfold. "Stop it." "Oh my God, stop," Debbie screamed. her cries echoing the intensity of her time with the men. Her mother fainted, and her father tried to revive her, his eyes glaring at Debbie with anger. Once her mother regained consciousness, her father turned to Debbie, sternly saying, "I want you out of our house today." The reality of her actions had drastically changed their perception of her. Helping his wife to her feet, he paused at the door, then turned to me and said, "You didn't have to go that far. Would you have believed me otherwise?" I asked. "Probably not, but there had to be a better way. There was your daughter shouldn't have cheated," I replied. After that encounter, we never heard from them again. When the court date came, neither Debbie nor her attorney showed up. 6 weeks later, I was officially divorced, retained all our modest assets, and didn't have to pay alimony. Another 6 weeks passed, and I received orders to deploy to a conflict zone in the Middle East. Before leaving, I spent 2 days with Ruth and her husband, then went back home to visit my parents and siblings. I left my truck at my parents' house for my dad to use while I was deployed. Adrian was busy with another tour, and my other 2 siblings were still living in Madisonville, both married with kids. My year in the Middle East went by with only a few unsettling moments. Upon my return, I was promoted to captain, which was a nice recognition. My next assignment took me to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where I was given command of the garrison at the Command and General Staff College. This was a prestigious post for any captain, but landing it as a relatively new captain felt like a mistake. I even called the assignment office in Washington, D.C., to confirm. "Captain Payne, are you complaining?" the officer asked. "Because if you are, there are plenty of other captains eager to take your spot." "No, not at all. I'm very happy," I replied. "I just wanted to make sure I wouldn't be reassigned after a few months if someone realized a mistake." "Don't worry, Captain Payne. You're assigned here for 3 years unless, of course, we need you back in the Middle East. If that happens, feel free to send one of those other captains you mentioned instead of me," I joked, and we both laughed. Settling into my new role didn't take long. Having an experienced first sergeant to manage daily operations made the transition smoother. One Saturday, I went to the post auto repair shop, which provided space and tools for minor vehicle repairs and had an expert mechanic available if needed. I wasn't a professional, but growing up in the countryside had taught me enough to handle basic repairs like oil changes. When I arrived, the shop wasn't busy, so I got started on changing my oil. The shop had 3 pits for working under cars, and I was about 5 minutes into my task when another car pulled into the pit beside mine. I paid little attention until I heard a frustrated female voice curse loudly. The noise paused briefly, followed by the clatter of a wrench hitting the concrete. "Ouch! Damn it," the voice muttered again. Amused, I decided to see if I could help. I tightened my drain plug, climbed out of my pit, and went over to the next one. A woman, wearing coveralls that were slightly too big for her, was struggling with her car. "Need some help?" I asked. She glanced at me, and despite the oil-smeared face, I could tell she was probably quite pretty. Spitting out some oil, she snapped, "Why do you assume I need help? Is it because I'm a woman and women supposedly can't change their own oil?" "Not at all," I replied. "It just sounded like you were having some trouble, so I thought I'd offer." "I appreciate it, but I'm fine. I know what I'm doing." "I just really hate this car," she said. "All right then, have a good day." I returned to my car, added the oil, and left without seeing her again. The following week, I attended a cocktail party hosted by the commanding general. My invitation came because of my role as garrison commander, not because I usually mingled with the high-ranking generals and colonels at Fort Leavenworth. With a Coke in hand, I wandered around, hoping to find other officers close to my age and rank that I could connect with. I wasn't hopeful about meeting anyone, and unsurprisingly, I didn't. Checking my watch, I realized I had about 15 minutes left before it would be polite to leave. The backyard looked like a nice place to kill some time, so I headed there. Just as I was about to step outside, I overheard a voice. Anyway, Dad kept insisting I learn to do things myself in case I ever got stranded, so I decided to change my own oil. It took forever. I ended up covered in oil from my hair to my fingernails, and even got some in my mouth. I spilled it all over the instruction manual, making it nearly unreadable. But the worst part was when this really good-looking guy offered to help, and I turned him down. If I'd been smart, I would have asked for his name and number. Her group laughed, and another woman asked, "What do you mean? You should have asked for his number. You've never done that before." I know, but there was something about him, something I can't quite put into words. Even though I was frustrated, I felt a spark. Wow, he must have made quite an impression. I think he did. I smiled to myself, intrigued by who was speaking, and curious to see what she looked like without the oil stains. I stepped outside onto the patio and glanced around. To my right, I spotted 3 women, one of whom appeared close to my age, or maybe a bit younger. She briefly met my eyes before I turned back inside, realizing she recognized me. I found a spot in the corner where I could observe without drawing attention. From there, I watched as the 3 women re-entered and headed straight for the front door. In military homes, there's often a stand by the entrance where visitors leave calling cards displaying their name and rank. It's a common tradition for guests to leave a card during each visit. The women gathered around the card tray, sifting through the cards until they found one. They huddled together, examining it before glancing over in my direction. I tried to blend in, but as the only company grade officer, a second lieutenant, first lieutenant, or captain in a room full of field grade officers, I stood out. Figuring out which card was mine wouldn't have been difficult since I was the only officer below major rank, and my uniform's nameplate clearly read Payne. Debating whether to approach her and mention her car, which would reveal my identity, or to wait and see how things played out, I opted to hold back. I hadn't been on a real date in a long time and was looking for a connection, but patience seemed like the wiser choice. When the moment felt right, I approached the hostess, the wife of Major General Morris T. Woodley thanked her for the evening and grabbed my hat. It was easy to spot, as it was the only one on the table without gold braid on its bill. I sneaked several glances at the 3 women, who were just as discreetly watching me. The woman and I had 2 things in common: the General's party and the auto repair shop. I couldn't linger at the General's house, hoping she'd show up, but I could certainly hang around the shop. By Saturday morning, I was at the shop, washing and waxing my truck. I was nearly finished when I noticed her car pull in. This time, she was dressed in jeans and a white t-shirt with gold glitter instead of coveralls. While my truck was parked inside, she pulled up outside. As she got out of her car and walked toward the shop, a man I recognized as a major from the BQ approached her. He struck up a conversation, and it seemed she was trying to get away, but he kept her engaged. Our eyes met briefly before I looked away. Since I was done with my task and others were waiting for my spot, I had to leave. Her gaze followed me as I got into my truck and drove off. I pulled over on the side of the road to wait, and within 5 minutes, I saw her speeding toward me. I headed to the Post Exchange PX, which is similar to a Walmart. The parking lot was packed, so I had to park far from the entrance. Close to the door were reserved spots, including one for the commanding general, and I noticed her car was parked there. For a moment, I thought about going home, but luckily, I decided against it. As I walked into the PX, she was standing just inside the entrance. Playing hard to get, she asked with a smile. "No, I am." "Why?" "Are you trying to get me?" I replied. She burst out laughing. "That's an interesting question." "I'm not sure. Can you really be won over?" I asked. "Probably, but I'm not exactly easy," she replied, pointing toward the snack stand down the hall. "Would a Coke be enough?" I laughed. "As long as you don't expect too much at the snack stand." We each got a Coke. Hers was diet, and she paid for both. We found a table and ended up talking for 3 hours without even noticing the time. Her phone rang at least 6 times, but she ignored every call. Finally, she glanced at her watch and jumped up. "Oh no, I have a date. I've got to go." I stood up and said, "Now who's being elusive?" We walked to her car, and she drove off to meet her date. Not having had a good meal in a while, I decided to head to the officer club, known for its excellent prime rib. I went back to my BOQ, relaxed for a bit, showered, put on a civilian suit, and made my way to the club. The dining room was closed for a private event, but the grill was open, so I chose to eat there. After finishing my meal, I was about to leave when I glanced into the dining room. There, in the doorway, I saw the major from the BRQ dancing closely with a woman wait. I realized I still didn't know her name. Despite all our conversation, I had never asked, and she hadn't told me. I stayed and watched them dance until another couple bumped into them, and she glanced my way. I quickly turned and headed for the exit. Since the BOQ was just a short walk away, I made my way back. The lobby had 2 large TVs, a bar, and a snack table often stocked by the officer club. I settled in with a Coke and watched a rerun of a NASCAR race. After spending about 2 hours there, I was ready to head to my room when the major walked in. He grabbed a beer and sat in a big chair close to mine. He started a conversation about the race, and then asked, "Aren't you the garrison commander?" "Yes, I am," I replied. He extended his hand. "I'm Ernie Bigelow from Post G3 Operations." "Lewis Payne," I said. "You already know where I work." We took a seat and continued chatting. Ernie was easygoing, so after a while, I mentioned seeing him dancing at the club earlier. "Your date looked familiar," I noted. He laughed. "That's because she's General Woodley's daughter, Christina." "Just curious. Is there anything between you two?" I asked. He chuckled. "No way. No one gets close to Miss Iceberg. I've gone out with her a few times, but whenever I think we're making progress, she shuts me down." "Why do you keep trying?" then I inquired. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe I'm hoping she'll warm up. Or maybe I just like the challenge," he said, glancing at me. "It's funny you asked about her, though. She saw you tonight and asked if I knew who you were." He laughed again. I didn't want any more competition, so I told her I had no idea. Ernie Bigelow and I ended up becoming friends. 3 days later, Christina Woodley called and invited me to dinner, and I accepted. That evening, while sitting in the BOQ lobby, Ernie joined me. He looked at me and said, "I hear you've got a date with Christina." "Yes, Friday night." "How did you find out?" I asked. "I called her to ask her out, and she immediately told me she had a date with you," he said. "By the way, is it with who or with whom?" "Honestly, I was surprised myself," I replied. "She's usually pretty private with her number." "How did you get it?" "I don't have it. She never gave it to me," I explained. "So how did you set up the date? You can't just show up at her door." I paused. "I didn't actually ask her, she called me. I hadn't really thought about how she got my number. She must have used the calling card. I found it at her place, and had access to the post telephone directory. Simple as that." He stared at me for a moment before bursting into laughter. "Well, I'll be darned. I've known her for nearly 2 years, and she's never asked a guy out before. You must be something special." "I wouldn't say that," I replied. "Let me tell you, Christina does date, but it's pretty rare. Since I've been around, she's only gone out with me and 2 other guys. We're a close group and keep tabs on each other, hoping one of us will make some progress. So far, all she's given are a few slow dances and some pecks on the cheek." We continued our conversation, and as I mentioned, Ernie and I had become friends. He genuinely wished me luck with Christina. "Just keep me posted, and I'll make sure the other 2 know how things are going with you." Our dinner dates went great. In fact, they went so well that I continued asking her out. Eventually, Ernie found out he was being transferred to Korea and invited Christina to a farewell dinner. She turned him down, saying, according to him, "I really like Lewis, Ernie. I like him a lot, and I don't want to mess things up." I always picked Christina up at her house for our dates and interacted with her parents. They didn't seem to dislike me, but they weren't exactly warm or welcoming either. After dating Christina for 6 months, I had reached what you might call second base, which, for us, meant touching her top. She mentioned that no one else had ever gotten that far with her. In the 7th month of our relationship, I received orders to return to the Middle East. I called my branch to confirm. I thought I was on a 3-year stable assignment, I said to the assignment manager. You were, Lewis, but something must have gone wrong because we've been instructed to reassign you immediately. You need to be in country in 2 weeks. 2 weeks? That's really short notice. Everyone usually gets at least 30 days. I reached out to Christina, and she was even more upset than I was. After talking for a while, she ended the call by saying, "I love you, Lewis." She had never said that before. The next evening, I was packed and ready to leave the following morning. Christina was coming over to say goodbye when I heard a knock at my door. I opened it to find her standing there. She stepped into my arms, and we shared a kiss. "My father did this," she said suddenly. "Did what exactly?" I asked. "He's the reason you're being shipped out." "Why would he do that? He knows how much I care about you." "He's afraid of losing me. Eventually, he's going to lose me to you or someone else, whether it's now or later." "What do you mean by someone else?" "There's no one else, right?" "There will be, if you don't come back," she said, holding me tighter. "Don't talk like that," she pleaded, pulling away slightly and looking at me seriously. "Marry me." "What are you talking about?" "Marry me. That'll really get under his skin." I chuckled. "Getting married just to upset your father isn't a good reason." She let go and sat down in a chair. "Then I'll just stay here tonight. That would really drive him crazy." I laughed again. "I'd love for you to stay, but after arguing with your father, where do you think the MPs will look first if you don't go home?" "Then let's go to a motel off post," she suggested. I knelt in front of her. "I love you too much to let our first night together be about revenge or hiding. It should be a moment we're proud of and want to share with the world." She cupped my face, kissed me, and laughed. "I've already done that. Everyone at Leavenworth knows I love you, especially my father. That's why he had you reassigned." As we sat close together in the chair, the temptation was overwhelming. It had been a long time since I'd had intimacy, and here was a 26-year-old innocent girl ready to be with me. Still, I wanted our first time to be special, and this didn't feel right. Our kissing was interrupted when her phone rang. "Hello, Mom," she said, putting the call on speaker. "Where are you?" her mother's voice asked. "At the barbecue with Lewis." "When are you coming home?" "Not until Lewis leaves tomorrow." She glanced at me with a smile. Her mother gasped. "You know your father will be furious, don't you?" "He's already done his worst, Mom. Having Lewis transferred was his way of hurting us." "What should I tell him?" "Tell him I'm an adult and I'll make my own decisions. Goodbye, Mother." "You realize the MPs are probably on their way by now," I said. "I don't care." "That's easy for you to say since you'll just go home, but I'll be the one facing jail time." She threw herself into my arms, and we held each other, kissing passionately for a long time. Then she looked deeply into my eyes. "I love you, you know that. I've never been in love before, and I know you love me too. Want to know how I know?" "Yes," I replied. "Apart from the 2 times you've touched me, you haven't tried to go further. That tells me you respect me and aren't rushing things. We both know it will happen eventually. You'll be the first man to make love to me." She started unbuttoning her blouse, and once it was undone, she slid it off. Then she reached behind and unclasped her bra, removing it without a second thought. Pulling me close, she guided my head toward her chest. I had touched her before, but had never kissed her there. "No one's ever done this," she sighed, her breath trembling. "I want you to remember this and come back for more." I kissed her gently, savoring the moment, until I finally pulled away. "We need to stop now. or we won't be able to stop at all, I said. I get it, but I didn't know it would feel this good, she replied, breathless. She put her blouse back on, but left her bra off. Just remember, these are mine. No one else gets to see or touch them, she said with a smile before kissing me. They're yours forever. She stood up, picked up her bra, and walked over to my duffel bag, which was still open. She carefully folded her bra and placed it inside, then glanced at me one last time before leaving, tears rolling down her cheeks. The next morning, I was waiting for Major General Woodley when he arrived at his headquarters. As his driver pulled up, I stood by to open the door. He seemed surprised to see me, though he knew who I was. "Why are you here, Captain?" he asked. "I'm here to tell you what kind of cowardly father I think you are. You might be a good general, but as a parent, you're failing. You can send me anywhere, even to the federal prison on this installation, but I'm going to speak my mind. I care deeply for your daughter. And she says she loves me too. That might be news to you because, from what I see, she's never been in love before, and that scares you. You're afraid that someday you'll lose her to another man. Maybe it'll be me, Ernie Bigelow, a private in boot camp, or some civilian doctor. But one day, she'll leave, and I hope it hurts you as much as you've hurt her by using your influence to have me transferred. When you see her at dinner tonight, remember that you've broken her heart. You've caused her pain. And though she might eventually forget about me, which I'm sure you hope for, she will fall in love again and again. And each time she does, you'll lose a part of her until all that's left is her hatred." I turned and walked away without saluting. I fully expected to be stopped, detained, or jailed as I left the post, but none of that happened. Instead, I drove to Ruth's house, then continued to my parents' place, planning to leave my truck with them while I was away. I put my few belongings into storage and spent a day with Ruth. During my visit, she caught me up on what had happened with my ex-wife. Apparently, her obsession with intimacy led her to stripping and selling herself on the side. Her parents had disowned her after seeing the video of her with the two men and never spoke to her again once she moved out. Even Ruth's ex-boyfriend, her brother, cut ties with her. She'd been arrested at least 3 times for escorting and dealing pills and was currently in jail. After leaving Ruth's, I spent 3 days with my parents. I spoke with Christina several times before I left and learned that the day I departed Leavenworth, she moved out of her parents' house and into a furnished apartment in town, which greatly upset her father. She refused to speak with him, and according to her mother, he was caught between anger and hurt. When I arrived at the departure point and checked in, the sergeant behind the counter reviewed my orders, then excused himself to consult with someone in the back office. A few minutes later, the lieutenant returned with a first lieutenant in tow. "Captain Payne, could you step into my office for a moment?" the lieutenant asked. I followed him inside. "Please, have a seat, Captain," he said, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. "Your orders have been revised. It seems the original orders were issued by mistake. Fort Leavenworth is investigating the matter, but here are your new instructions. You are to return to Leavenworth and resume your previous duties." He threw up his hands in disbelief. "I've seen orders change before, but I've never seen a case where someone is sent back to their old position. On top of that, we received this yesterday, marked as personal correspondence, specifically to be delivered to you." The lieutenant handed me a sealed envelope with the commanding general of Fort Leavenworth's return address. "Congratulations, Captain. You're going back home," the lieutenant said. Stepping outside, I opened the envelope to find a short note that read, "You were right, it was signed simply, Mr. Woodley." I immediately called Christina, and she answered on the first ring. "Where are you?" she asked. "I'm heading home." "Did you know they cancelled my orders?" "No way. What happened?" she responded. "Looks like your father had a change of heart." "I'm going back to Leavenworth." "Oh my God. How soon can you get here?" "In a couple of days. I need to pick up my truck first. Then I'll drive straight over." "Hurry, sweetie. I'll start looking for a bigger apartment." I made record time on my way back, and we stayed on the phone for the last 50 miles. She ran out to meet me as I turned onto her street. The truck had barely come to a stop before I jumped out and into her arms. We hugged and kissed, oblivious to the traffic weaving around us. In military towns, emotional reunions in odd spots are pretty common. After a few minutes, we calmed down and went inside, where we continued kissing and embracing. Once the excitement subsided, we sat together on her couch and talked. Christina had spoken with her mother, but not her father yet. Her mum didn't know about the change in my orders, but seemed genuinely happy for her daughter when she found out. I showed Christina the brief note from her father. "What does this mean?" she asked. I explained what had happened when I confronted him the morning I left. "I'm amazed he didn't have you arrested for talking to him like that," she said. "Me too," I agreed. "I bet it went against everything he believes in to change your orders," she said. "He didn't do it for me, he did it for you, because he loves you. He's just having a hard time accepting that he's no longer the only man in your life." Her eyes were full of love as she looked at me. I stood up, pulled out the ring I had bought in Tennessee when I picked up my truck, and knelt down. Before I could speak, she began crying. "Christina Louise Woodley, will you marry me?" Without hesitation, she dropped to her knees, held out her left hand, and said, "Put it on my finger." Once the ring was on, she said, "Yes, Louis Hadley Payne, I will marry you and love you until the day I die." The kiss we shared was transformative, resonating deeply within me, and I knew I would love her for the rest of my life. Every man thinks his partner is the most beautiful and perfect, and I was no different. I suggested we spend our first night together at a luxury hotel, but she declined. "This apartment is our first home. I want our first night to be here," she insisted. She had planned everything for my return in her unique way. For our first meal together in the apartment, we enjoyed champagne, pate, and chocolate-covered strawberries. I even had some of the champagne. She wanted to relax in a bubble bath before the evening began, and after her bath, she emerged wearing a baby blue set that included underwear and a matching cover-up that perfectly complemented the ensemble. While she opened the champagne and arranged the pate, I took a quick shower. When I came into the bedroom, I was dressed in only a bathrobe. We settled on the bed to eat and drink, sharing kisses every now and then. Gradually, the food was set aside as our kissing grew more intense until the tray was completely forgotten. Standing beside the bed, she untied the belt of my bathrobe while holding it closed. She looked deeply into my eyes. "This is the first time I've ever undressed a man, Louis. I always wanted it to be with the one I truly love, and that's you. People call me an ice queen, but I promise I'll be the best lover I can be when you want me to," she said. She gazed up at me and whispered, "It's beautiful, Louis, and it's all mine. I've heard of women doing BJS, but I never thought I'd do it myself. Now I can't wait." "Oh God, this is incredible, Louis. I've never experienced anything like this," she exclaimed, moving her hips in sync with mine. It was hard to believe someone Christina's age could still be so innocent, but her youthful enthusiasm was thrilling and enjoyable. By the time we finished, it was around 4 in the morning. We were awakened at 10 by her phone ringing. "Hello, Mom," she answered brightly, putting the call on speaker, as she usually did. "Good morning. Have you heard from Louis? Shouldn't he be back today?" her mother asked. Christina beamed at me. "He came home yesterday and spent the night with me, Mom," she replied. Her mother's voice lit up. "Oh, that's wonderful news. He proposed to me, and I said yes," Christina continued. "That's fantastic. When are you planning the wedding?" her mother asked, clearly delighted. Christina laughed. "We haven't set a date yet. We were thinking we'd discuss it with you and Dad at dinner tonight. Is that okay?" Surprised, I stared at Christina, feeling a bit thrown off. She noticed and winked at me. "That sounds great. What kind of wine does Louis like?" her mother inquired. "He doesn't usually drink, but he'll have some champagne with us, Christina replied. Perfect. We'll see both of you at 6:30. Does that work for you? That's perfect. See you then. Should I tell Dad about the engagement, or would you rather do it? Her mother asked. You can tell him if you think he'll take it well otherwise. Louis can tell him, Christina suggested. After ending the call, Christina turned to me and said, "Make sure you take care of me. Fiancé was a request I was always happy to fulfill." We arrived at exactly 6:30 and rang the doorbell. Her father answered. "Why are you ringing the bell?" "You have a key," he said to Christina. "I know, but I don't live here anymore, Daddy," she replied. I noticed him flinch slightly, but his mood lifted when Christina hugged him and kissed his cheek. I heard her softly whisper, "Thank you," as she kissed him. It was obvious that this was going to be a difficult conversation for him. He offered me his hand for a handshake, which I accepted. "Dinner is ready, so let's get started," he said. We were shown into the small family dining room instead of the formal dining area. Christina and I sat on opposite sides of the table, and the champagne was already poured. "Daddy, Mum, Louis has something he wants to share," Christina announced. I took a deep breath and started. "First, General Woodley, I want to express my appreciation for your assistance in getting my orders changed." I phrased it this way, fully aware that he was behind both the original orders and the reversal. Secondly, General Woodley, Mrs. Woodley, I want you to know that I love your daughter and have asked her to marry me. "And I accepted," Christina added, showing her ring first to her mother and then to her father. Her mother was overjoyed, beaming with happiness. Her father, clearly instructed to handle the situation with grace, managed to keep his composure and even raised a toast. After the meal, Christina and her mother left to begin planning the wedding, while the General and I went to the library, where he poured us each a glass of port. "I know you only drink on special occasions, and tonight certainly counts as one," he said, handing me the glass. "Congratulations, Louis, you've achieved something I hoped I wouldn't see." After taking a sip, he gestured for us to sit down. "I always knew this day would come eventually," he continued, shifting his tone. "You were right about me. I thought I knew what was best for my daughter, but seeing how she looked at you during dinner made me realize how wrong I was. My only request is that you take care of her and love her forever, just as you do now." "You can count on that, sir. I'd never do anything to hurt her," I assured him. "I believe you," he said. "However, there's one thing I'm having trouble with." "What's that, sir?" I asked. "I'm not comfortable with the idea of you two living together before the wedding," he admitted. It was clear Christina's mother had mentioned this concern to him. "There's not much room for negotiation on that, sir," I replied. "I figured as much, but I felt I should at least bring it up," he said with a sigh. 6 months after that dinner, Christina's father retired and became the CEO of a major auto parts division. 2 months later, Christina and I got married, and she was visibly pregnant as she walked down the aisle. My brother Adrian attended with his Nashville superstar, who gave an unexpected performance at our reception. He also gifted Christina's parents with copies of all his CDs, and since my parents only listened to gospel music, Adrian brought them several of his gospel recordings. The day after we returned from our honeymoon, Ernie Bigelow called to congratulate me. He also mentioned that he had won $1,000 from the other 2 guys who had dated Christina. They had bet that I would mess things up just like they had, but Ernie disagreed and ended up profiting. 2 months after the wedding, we welcomed our son, Jason Richard Payne. 6 months later, I decided to leave my military career and started working for my father-in-law. From the moment Jason could walk, he became incredibly close to his grandfather. They were practically inseparable, and my father-in-law often felt a twinge of envy whenever we visited my parents with Jason. During one of our trips to Tennessee, my sister Ruth filled me in on my ex-wife's situation. Her career had been going well until she got caught mailing some of her work, which the federal authorities do not take lightly, and now she's facing a prison sentence of 3 to 5 years. One weekend, while Jason was at his grandparents' lake house, Christina and I had the house to ourselves. We were cuddled up on the sofa watching a movie when she turned to me and asked, "Lewis?" "Yes," I replied. "Do you enjoy being a father?" "Absolutely. Why do you ask? Would you want to have another child?" I leaned back and looked at her closely. "Are you trying to tell me you're pregnant?" She placed her hand on my lap, gently rubbing it. "No, but I'd like to be."